Greetings everyone, my name is Dr. Jason Freeman and I'd like to welcome y'all to my channel. In this video, I'm going to give you the 5 books on Black history that I think everyone should read. Now at any point, feel free to click the notification bell or subscribe to my channel to get more content. So, without further ado, let's begin. Now, if you've seen any of my videos before, you may have noticed all these books behind me. So this is my bookshelf in my office. Now, I've accumulated these books over the years. So one book I have, it's like a vocabulary book I've had since high school. Everything else I've gotten in college, grad school at East Carolina, grad school at UNC Chapel Hill, and as well as being a faculty person here at Towson University. Now, for this list, I'll be pulling from books that, one, are from my own book collection, and 2, I've read at least once. Now, I do have one honorable mention, which I know I have read also, but I just can't find. Now, the honorable mention is titled Up From Slavery, and it was written by Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington was a Black conservative. You can think about him in a similar way as, say, Justice Clarence Thomas and Ben Carson. And so in the book, he lays out his conservative philosophy, talking about African Americans, quote unquote, earning freedom. Now, the thing about Booker T. Washington is, I will say politically, I fundamentally disagree with him, as I disagree with pretty much every Black conservative on many levels. But I think it's important to read at least once if you want to understand Black history, because one, Black conservatives have been around since the beginning of U.S. history, going back to even the earliest days of like slavery and even during like the Revolutionary period as well. And so Black conservatism has kind of had this presence in Black culture from the beginning. It still exists in the 21st century. And so I think it's important to kind of see the basic ideas of that philosophy, to understand Black culture, understand Black history, and, you know, as someone like me, to try to understand what the other side is thinking when they're advocating for certain things. All right, so now let's go ahead and get to my list of the 5 books on Black history that I think everyone should read. So let me go ahead and go to my collection. I'm going to pull number 5, which is Eyes on the Prize by Juan Williams. Now, this book talks about the Civil Rights Movement, documents the Civil Rights Movement from its beginnings with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, and goes all the way to 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. Now, what I like about the book is it's pretty comprehensive. It covers pretty much, I might say everything, but a lot of what you need to know about the major events of the Civil Rights era. So the sit-ins, the marches, the various political events that happened, the wins, the losses throughout the movement. And so I think it's important, if you want to understand the Civil Rights era, especially in the time where we're losing so many civil rights leaders, over time, as we kind of move into the 21st century, I think if you want to just get a good history, good understanding of that era, I think this is a good book to have, a good book to read. And just one side note, so Juan Williams, who, those of you who've seen like Fox News, and I'm not a fan of Fox News, I'm politically, I tend to be on the liberal to moderate side, but Juan Williams actually autographed this for me. I think I'll put a picture of that moment on the screen. But basically, I think it was kind of cool to kind of, one, hear him talk about the book, and then also to kind of, it's kind of cool to meet him. All right, so the 4th book on my list is not actually a history book, so I'm cheating a little bit. The book is titled The Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Now, the reason I'm including this work of fiction in my list is because even though it's a work of fiction, I would consider it a work of historical fiction. It talks about kind of slavery. So slavery is mentioned there in a very personal, very tragic way. If my memory kind of serves me right, there is an insinuated, if not directly discussed, sexual assault. It also talks about kind of early 20th century, where African Americans are starting to affirm themselves. There's a Black community and kind of a leader of a Black community that's talked about. issues related to kind of Black masculinity, and also just kind of seeing the progression of Black history in throughout this book. I think is important. Again, even though it's a fictionalized account. The other thing I think is important is that oftentimes, in thinking about some of the books in my list, the main people talked about are Black males. And I think it's important to have a book on a Black woman in particular, to kind of get that Black woman perspective. The book kind of talks about the kind of intersectional issues of discrimination. So not just a Black-white discrimination, but also sexism within the Black community. And the kind of the idea of kind of Black males feeling they need to dominate Black women because they are themselves being dominated by white culture. Another thing is with some of these books, and the things I like about some of these books is that they are enjoyable reads, and so this of all of them is probably one of the most enjoyable reads. I remember reading this in a African American literature course that had a huge impact on kind of how I saw the world and how I think about the world. And so I think it's important to kind of look at these books, and even though, again, this is a fictionalized account, to really understand the kind of context in which this book was written, and the idea that the issues the issues that the book kind of deals with has deep roots in Black culture and Black history and still affect us today. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I looked at the camera and I'm like, nah. Funny story. I had a student who I was teaching, and same kind of issue. My elbows too. Whew, cold out there. They, waved during class. I was walking around giving my lecture, and they signaled me, and they whispered, very sweet girl. It was not done in any kind of malicious way. And she was like, mentioned about my elbows, and it was nice. In context, it was not her being rude or snarky. It was her being nice. And so since then, make sure I have my lubricant. Now, a little bit about Zora Neale Hurston. She was actually an anthropologist. She was a researcher. She was a Black conservative as well, which led her to be ostracized by many in the Black community, including a friend of hers, Langston Hughes. And the reason that we know about Zora Neale Hurston today is because, if I'm not mistaken, Alice Walker kind of rediscovered her. Unfortunately, Miss Hurston, despite being an amazing writer, died in poverty, died not really being recognized. And it wasn't until Alice Walker came later and essentially rediscovered her. And that's why we know about her work. All right, so that brings me to number 3 on my list, which is over here. Levittown by David Kushner. All right, so a couple things about Levittown. So Levittown is one of those kind of manufactured communities it was actually in Pennsylvania. So it's a time where you have people leaving these ethnic neighborhoods and moving out into the suburbs, basically creating the suburbs. And so Levittown, Pennsylvania is just one of those suburbs. And so this true story is about the Myerses who came up from the South to start lives. The husband in the book, Bill, was an engineer. He actually was from that I think from Levittown, actually. I know he's from Pennsylvania. And so basically they're moving into this neighborhood, the first Black family in that community, and of course, chaos ensues. Night after night, they're harassed. People are banging on their door. They're calling them names. They're having rallies. They're trying to intimidate them and scare them. And the thing about the Myerses is that they were working along with civil rights leaders and other people to try to integrate this community. So they were prepared. And so the book documents the horrific things they dealt with. Unfortunately, there's one guy from Durham, North Carolina, who's one of the ringleaders. So, of course, representing my state very poorly. And so with that, it really kind of talks about and shows that period of American history where you're starting to see African Americans during the Great Migration starting to try to integrate some of these communities and some of the backlash they got from the local residents. And so I think it's important to read this book at least once. And it's not a well-known book, but I think it's an important book. Just because, again, it's a snapshot of a part of American history that oftentimes we ignore and don't think about. Again, in the North, where people think, you think about the South and racism, where, of course, Northern racism was also a big issue as well. And so I think it's important to read a book like this to really understand what was really going on in the country at the time. And some of the same stuff still happens today, though it's not as accepted widely. But again, intimidation, trying to scare people out of communities is something we still see to some extent today. Number 2 on my list is a book that I literally just had my students read and I teach a course called Blacks in America, so I just had my students read that book, and it's called The New Jim Crow. As the reason I'm talking about this book in relation to Black history, even though mass incarceration is still a major issue, is because the book is a bit dated. So it was written a while ago, and so there have been some reforms in regards to criminal justice system. There are efforts trying to, change our system, especially when it comes to nonviolent drug offense. And so some of the book is a bit dated. It was actually this is probably the last time I'm going to use this book. Also, in the comment section, give me suggestions for books on Black history or Black criminal justice system, culture that you think we should, maybe use. But basically, and I'll be looking over the next year or so as well. But basically, I'm gonna replace this book. But this book is important because it does again give a snapshot of kind of the kind of situation of mass incarceration, kind of how it started. And so the book talks about, Jim Crow segregation. It talks about slavery. It talks about what's going on at that period and how it's connected to the current situation with mass incarceration. And so I think it's important to, when you're looking at history, to not think of it as this thing that happened just that time, but to kind of see the connections as to what's happening today. And so the New Jim Crow is in many ways epitomizes that. It talks about Jim Crow segregation that started in the late 19th century. Talks about kind of the early 20th century where you see the continuation of Jim Crow up through the 1960s at least, and then how that Jim Crow in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s has kind of evolved into this kind of Jim Crow system where African Americans are still being disenfranchised, still being segregated, and still being oppressed by the system. And that brings me to my number 1 book that I think everyone should read on Black history. This is a book that I would say changed my life when I read it. I read it when I was in college, and it was one of those books that really was important in my kind of development as a sociologist, as a scholar, as a Black man. And that book is, let me go ahead and reach in distance right here. I don't have to get up. All right. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Now, it's funny and interesting that I ended up teaching in Towson University. So Towson, Maryland is in Baltimore County. So we're just north of Baltimore City. And so one of the most famous Baltimoreans, if not the most famous Baltimoreans in history, is Frederick Douglass. Now, in the book, Frederick Douglass literally talks about his life being the son of a woman slave and a white master who, of course, with sexual assault. He talks about, the breaking process of the slave breaker trying to break his will. He talks about his escape, and then talks about his life after slavery. He talks about his travels. He talks about his philosophy, and really makes his arguments against slavery and the slave system. Now, one of the things I love about the book is how he talks about how his education really is what emancipated him. I'm not going to give the story away. It's something I definitely think you should read. But the idea is that him learning to read was pivotal in him being able to escape, and how he learned to read was pretty showed his intelligence. And so you have someone who's born into a system where nothing is expected of them, where they're thought to be ignorant, thought to be inferior, and he showed how that intelligence, that cunning allowed him to not only educate himself, but also to escape slavery and essentially get the ear of the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, to end slavery in the United States. So one thing that I tell my students is that this man learned how to read. He influenced the president to change the laws, which allowed me and my family to be free today. And so those are the 5 books I think that, when I first thought about this, I'm going to say Black people should read, but I think everyone should read these books because it will educate you and get you a deeper understanding of Black history and Black culture. America would not be America without the presence of Black people and the influences that we have made to this country since the beginnings, or even before the country existed. And so I think these books, again, cover a wide swath of American history, from slavery to Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Movement, all the way with the new Jim Crow to the current situation with criminal justice system. Now, if you found this video interesting and or informative, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also, please share this video. I really would appreciate it. Also, please leave a comment in the comment section below, giving me a suggestion for books that you think everyone should read on Black history. Now, I do have plans to do another video like this next year, looking at kind of international books, so books on the African diaspora as a whole that I think you all should read. I have a couple in here that I'm going to be talking about, so I'm getting that ready. And so again, if you have actually some books that in that regard, so looking at not just the United States, but the larger African diaspora, give me some suggestion. I can see if those can maybe push some of the books off my list. And of course, I'm always looking for something else to read. Thank you all for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.